As we go through today, the primary focus is to really outline for you what it takes to be a great leader and what it's going to take in order to identify, develop, and retain the best of the best. We are absolutely in a talent war now that we've never really been in before. We've always competed for the best kinds of employees, but now more than ever, we're competing in such a way that we have to first inspire people to want to work and then want to work for us. Then second, we have to be able to create an atmosphere where people can't imagine going anywhere else. So as we get started on this, I want to give you a little breakout of what the current state of affairs is with the generations. Right now in today's workforce, only about 12% of the total workforce is baby boomers. Boomers were born between 1946 and 1964. Gen Z, the newest generation entering the workforce, or the other side of the generational spectrum, they were born from 2001 to 2020. They make up now 9% of the workforce. They've been entering the workforce rapidly for the last roughly 4 years. The millennial generation is the majority and will be the majority for at least the next 20 years. They are 76 million strong in the millennial generation. And with that generation, born between 1981 and roughly the year 2000, this generation I have always found to be one of the more misunderstood generations, primarily because there's 3 different sets of values that exist within this generation. So the millennial generation was taught that what they were going to do in life was going to make an impact, and then it was going to have purpose. And so when they came into the workplace, really kind of taking the workplace by storm in around 2006, 2007, we were having a bit of an economic downturn and a bit of a crash. So they faced some real challenges. You'll see significant differences in the way that the millennials view the world, from the older millennials to the middle millennials to the younger millennials. And so that's why I think they've been pretty misunderstood. They bring a wealth of talent, some incredible ability to solve problems when we tap into the style of work that they really wanted. Next is Gen X, and this is my generation, smallest generation in US history, born from 1965 to 1980, about a 5-year shorter generational cycle. But also within this generation, they were the first generation not to define themselves by their job. And that's an important point to remember, because starting with Gen X, going into millennial and going into Gen Z, you see that the generations now look for a sense of purpose, and they look for a reason to be engaged. And if we as leaders don't create that right culture and that right leadership style, we don't end up keeping people. We are, with this talent war that we're in right now, what we're really trying to figure out is, how is it that I can get young people to want to work, want to do their very best, and want to stay with me? Because if you look at the turnover rate that exists from boomer generation, they were expected to have about 5 jobs in their working life. With Generation X, they were expected to have about 10 jobs in their life. The millennials were expected to have between 15 and 20 jobs throughout their working career. And there's not really an estimate yet on Generation Z. But all I know is, when you look at the reason that people work for people, not for companies anymore. You go back to the boomer generation, because they defined themselves by their job, they worked for businesses or for companies. So they identified their kind of internal self-concept with the place that they worked. Now you see with Xers, millennials, and Gen Z, they identify their internal self-concept with the people that they work with and the purpose that they fulfill. So they're trying to find their work more than they're trying to find their job. And there's a strong distinction in work versus job, because work is based in the purpose that exists for us, as opposed to just what we get paid to do in our working life. Now, the Great Resignation, as the media has been calling this, really started back around April of this year. And this is kind of normal from a psychological perspective, that when you go through intense amounts of stress and struggle, go back to those 6 human needs that I talked about, we haven't had certainty. We haven't had self-direction because there's been so many new rules and new things that we've had to deal with. We haven't had as much connectedness because we haven't been around one another. We haven't had the chance to feel as significant as what we used to because we're not getting affirmation and feedback as often as what we used to. So we have all of these things that have been playing into the reason that we feel different. The highest people who have resigned are 30 to 45-year-olds, which was kind of a surprise to me. I would have anticipated that this would have more to do with people retiring and less to do with people changing up lifestyle and lifestyle focus. But if you read the research that's out there, the Ascent, as well as what's been on CNBC and Harvard Business Review, what they're talking about is that we've had such a stronger struggle finding people to work in childcare. So we've had less opportunity for people to have childcare. And when we started going back to work and stopped working at home, it caused a bit of a rift where one person, either the husband or the wife, had to stay home to take care of the kids because they didn't have the opportunity to send them to daycare anymore. The second highest resignation is with baby boomers. And this year, we will see more baby boomers retire than we've ever seen in a single year. The retirements for boomers has already topped 4 million baby boomers this year leaving the workforce. To compare that, last year, 2.4 million baby boomers retired. So we will pretty close to double the amount of retirements with boomers this year versus 2020. And it's expected to continue to kind of follow this trend through next year. Resignations are the lowest in Generation Z, the 20 to 25-year-olds, but healthcare and tech are experiencing the highest. And a lot of the trend ties to changes that people are wanting in the workplace. What I have seen is in organizations that started investing early in the leadership development of their people, they didn't experience the resignation in the same way that other organizations did. To kind of put a big perspective on this, in September of this year, 3% of the total US workforce quit their job voluntarily. In August, the same thing was true. August set a record for the most number of resignations in a single month for 3 decades, and that was 4.3 million. It was 4.4 million in September. So the good news, not to be a downer on all of this, there is good news as well. When you look at highly engaged employees, what you find is that those who are engaged produce as much as 3 times on the work output as those who are doing enough to not get fired. According to the Gallup organization, roughly 60% of our current workforce is in that disengaged category. They're doing enough to keep their job and not lose their job, but they're not really doing any more than that. The number one factor in engagement, according to Gallup's research, is when we as leaders create the right leadership atmosphere, we create retention. So engagement is tied very specifically to whether or not we have the ability to get people to want to focus. So that ability to create leadership within our organizations, which is a very learnable skill, is how we get people on the same page. But that means we have to create a common leadership language. Within this leadership language, there's 3 primary aspects to how we are building culture. And so I want to take you through what those 3 are. And we do a whole other program called Building a Bold Culture that really goes in depth into alignment, workflow, and feedback. But the younger generation, starting with Gen X and working its way down, they're looking for what are the values of this organization and are they behaving in a way that matches the values? That's been the struggle that we've seen with things like MCI, WorldCom. 20 years ago, I believe it was yesterday, was when Enron filed for bankruptcy. So a lot of those organizations said their values were this, they did something completely different. So alignment of values creates this safety net and this sense of security and certainty that employees are looking for. That is building the right skills, vision, and purpose. that put us in alignment for where we want to go. The second factor in your culture is clear workflow. Now, here's a big struggle that I've seen really in the last 3 years, so pre-pandemic even, is that a lot of the onboarding process that we're doing for our new employees is, hey, go watch that person do what they do. Well, the reality is that's not teaching people to get to where we want them to be. What we're trying to do is we're trying to get a very clear understanding and a clear set of expectations that moves people in the right direction. When you're creating your workflow in the very first 60 to 90 days that you have a person, you want to set really clear, really strong expectations for what you need from them. That means you need to map out what are all the skills that they need to learn, and then who is going to teach each of those skills. The very simple strategy is if you just make an Excel spreadsheet that says, here's the position, you pick a tab for that. Here are the list of skills. Here are the individuals that are going to teach the skills. When the person teaching the skill to this new person says, I believe you've mastered it, they sign off on it. When the individual says, I can demonstrate it effectively, and I believe I've mastered it, they sign off on it. Now you've got a clear roadmap for the first 90 days. The 90-day window for creating the right onboarding and workflow creates a measurable strategy for their success. It's also a very strong predictor of whether you're going to keep a person for a year. If you have them fully engaged for that first 90 days, the likelihood of you keeping them for an entire year goes up by more than 80%, according to the Gallup organization. That's phenomenal. That means that a big part of how we retain people is that we train them effectively on the skill sets of their job, and we make sure that we have a strategy for how that's supposed to work. The third piece of your culture is the feedback process. So in your feedback process, you're trying to make sure that once a month, you have a sit down with your direct reports. This is a 15 to 30-minute conversation talking about their specific performance, what's working, what's not working, and how you're going to get them to where you need them to be. As a part of what we teach in leadership, when you learn to coach effectively, you use a model called the SOFT model. And it's setting expectations, observing their behaviors, following a 3-question process, which leads to teaching them to lead themselves. The 3 questions, whenever they make a mistake or things are off track, are, can you walk me through what happened? At what point could you have done it different? And then the third question, which leads to them leading themselves, is, what's your plan for next time to get the outcomes that we wanted? 3 simple questions, but what we normally do in performance feedback is somebody messes something up and we go, why did you do that? And the reality is nobody knows why they did what they did. They just did it. So what we've got to be able to do is get away from that, but why, and get into something that actually creates internal ownership or internal accountability to keep them going in the right direction. Hans Selye was a German philosopher. He's also an endocrinologist that studied stress. But I love one of his quotes that said, if the only tool you have in your toolbox is a hammer, then all of your problems have to be nails. That's what happens with a lot of young leaders is they come into the workplace and they go, I don't know how to get people to perform at the level that I want. So I'm just going to beat them over the head and push them harder and harder to get them to go where I want them to go. Well, the problem with that strategy is there's only so much abuse any of us are willing to take. So the more tools you have, the easier it is to get people to go in the right direction. When I lived in Abilene before I moved to Amarillo, my next door neighbor was the lead trainer for B-1 pilots, for the B-1 bomber. Fantastic guy. Imagine Top Gun. He looked like Tom Cruise, wore the aviator glasses, and drove a sports car. So he had a really nice sports car, but then one day he comes home and I hear him coming up the street. You hear the rumble of this amazing vehicle, and he had bought a new Mustang Shelby Cobra. He had been on the waiting list for it, and he got the Cobra. He pulls it into the driveway carefully. I'm coming out to see what this beauty looks like, and he goes, it looks nice, doesn't it? I'm like, it sounds even better than it looks. He goes, well, I always try to change the oil on a car as soon as I get it to make sure I know where everything is, how everything works. Do you want to help me? I'm like, absolutely. Well, the problem was that I crawled under the car. We got it on these special ramps, crawled under the car, um, removed the plug to drain the oil. And then we went in to remove the filter, and we had the wrong size filter wrench. We tried and tried, and you have to snake your arm through that engine. It's so massive. Couldn't get the filter off. I thought, well, I was a Boy Scout. I'm going to try something different. So I took my belt off, tried to use my belt to get it off. We tried a rubber hose. We tried everything we could think of. We could not get the filter off. The oil is already out of there. So we hop in my not quite so cool car, run over to the auto parts store, buy the right size filter wrench, and come back. Slip it over, pull the filter off, just like that. The thing that I learned in that, and that it reinforced related to leadership, is that in anything that we're doing, if you have the right set of tools, the project's pretty easy. But if you have the wrong set of tools, you just keep yourself more and more frustrated. 2 hours is what we spent trying to remove it with all the creative ways that we could. 30 minutes going there, coming back with the right size filter wrench, and about $10 later, it worked just fine. Having the right tools in your toolbox sets you apart as a leader from everyone else. And I can pretty well guarantee every one of you that's on this webinar right now, you have worked for a leader that you really loved and respected, and you would want to follow that leader wherever they went. And I can also guarantee just about that pretty much everybody here has worked for a leader at some point that you thought, what is wrong with this person? They need some medicine or some help or some therapy or something, because they're a horrible leader. Our evaluation of the other person is based on whether or not they had the right tool set to be a leader and to take us in the right direction. That's frustrating for a lot of people, because what we tend to do is we tend to promote people to the next level of leadership before they're actually ready for that. Our belief, our mindset about who we are and where we're at creates our self-concept or our story of self. When we promote people before they're ready, they try to do what they think is right, even if they don't really have any idea what actually is right. So our belief about self is a set of stories or self-concepts that are rolling around in our head that determine what we think. Those thoughts that we think as a result of the stories we've made up about ourselves will determine what we do. What we do will determine the outcomes or the results that we get. So often when we're trying to change people, when they're not behaving in the right path or the right direction that we want them to, we just go to them and we address just the action. But we don't think about the story that's playing in their head. So when you use the right tools of leadership, what you're doing is you're going back to, what's the story that they made up about this situation that resulted in their thoughts, their actions, and these outcomes? That's why you get them to explain, can you walk me through the process that you followed that got us to the place we're at instead of to the place that we wanted? In that simple conversation, you start to unlock what is it that they're believing about themselves. The moment they change a self-belief, the thoughts, the actions, and the outcomes change as well. The same is true of leadership. So you look at the other side from, we've had leaders that we loved and leaders that we couldn't stand. You've probably also hired somebody at some point that you ended up wishing you had never met. Most people have done that at one point or another. This is what's fascinating to me. When I first started really diving into leadership over 20 years ago, I started looking at why I wasn't getting the outcomes I wanted with one of my people. That was my first reason for studying leadership, is I was thinking, is it me or are they crazy? And so I wanted to look internally before I just blamed somebody else for the situation. And I started reading some books. The first book that I read on leadership was The 1 Minute Manager. It's an excellent book by Ken Blanchard. Really enjoyed it. After reading that book and using some of the very simple principles that were in the book, it made me start thinking, there's something to this, because that employee that I wanted to get rid of all of a sudden started performing. They started performing not because they magically became a better person. They started performing because I finally started approaching leadership from the right angle. And when I approached it from the right angle, what I discovered is they responded according to the way that I led them. In 1968, Lawrence J. Peter came up with this principle, which he was actually poking fun at corporate America with, called the Peter Principle. And it's what I described a minute ago. People are systematically promoted to a level beyond what they've been trained to do. The more we learn to develop people to the levels that we need them to be at, the easier it is to get people to go in the right direction. So, I'm gonna somebody that just joined. I'm gonna mute you there, Colin. There we go. So you got to pay attention to the way that you're leading. When you lead in the right manner, you engage people's emotional center of their brain. There's two sides to the brain. There's the logical side and there's the emotional side. The logical side is the prefrontal cortex, and that's where language is housed. The emotional side, though, according to research from Dr. Antonio Damasio, this is where all decisions are made. So if we understand that every decision that's being made is made at an emotional level, that helps us understand why the self-concept is so critically important. The emotional decision-making is why I stay or why I go. Logically, it doesn't make sense to jump jobs. You go from one job to another, you're having to learn the new people, the new culture, the new systems, the new everything, and it's a bigger struggle than staying where you're at. But emotionally, when people get burned out, when they don't feel valued and appreciated, when we don't communicate with them in the right manner, that's what drives them to make an emotional decision to take off and go somewhere else. So I want you to think about the perspective of what you have experienced from other leaders. When you think about your own experience from other leaders, you start to understand why you're doing what you're doing. Let me flip over here. So I know I get tired of drama. I don't know about you guys, but drama is the least fun thing that we actually deal with in the workplace. And from the perspective of drama, there's three basic reasons that drama is going to end up happening. The first reason is we try to be the hero to people and do their job for them. I had this conversation yesterday with one of my clients out in Colorado. They're like, at what point can I be a strong leader? I'm like, every point. Like, you literally should always be a strong leader. When we try to hero people, what we're doing is saying, I'm going to give you this shot that goes beyond what you've earned or what you deserve, because I know that I can save you. We hire people that have a track record of not performing. We give people the benefit of the doubt sometimes when they haven't earned the opportunity. If we respect people for who they are and what they're capable of, that means that we don't do their job for them, but instead we care deeply enough about their success then that we invest time and energy in helping them to get their job done in the right way by developing the right skill sets. When I lead in the right way, I'm not saving anybody. I am instead demonstrating the right example of values and leadership so that they get to make the choice to lead themselves into success. Second reason for drama is victimhood. When people play the victim, they're looking for someone to blame for things that have gone wrong. If we allow people to play the victim in the workplace instead of helping them become effective problem solvers, what we're going to find is that we're running around constantly dealing with conflict. Victimhood creates conflict in corporate America. You as a leader will spend an average right now of 5 weeks full-time per year dealing with conflict, most of which isn't actually your conflict. It's between other people, or it's things that were set up because somebody tried to play the hero or somebody tried to play the villain. The victimhood model is a center point between heroes and villains. You can't have a victim without a hero, and you can't have a victim without a villain. The villain a lot of times started out as a hero. They were trying to save people, they're trying to make things better, but it didn't work. And they get tired of feeling like they're taken advantage of. And so leaders sometimes snap when they don't have the right skills or tactics to get people to go in the right direction. When they snap or they get like at their wits' end and they want to just go fire people, they move into that villain state instead of being what's called an empathetic driver. To be empathetic is to try to see the world from the other person's perspective. To be a driver is to not back down from pushing them to solve their own problems. In the Harvard Business Review article, The Monkey on My Back, this was back in 1972, so the year that I was actually born. But in that article, it talks about this young manager that just wanted to create a better place for the people that were working for him. So what he ended up doing is this person comes into his office and says, "Boss, I'm really struggling with this budget. Do you think you could help me?" And the boss goes, "I'm amazing with budgets. Give that to me. I'll get it done." Play the hero. The person goes away. 4 days later, he doesn't have the budget back, and he goes back to the boss, says, "Boss, I'm going to get in trouble because not only are you expecting the budget, but your boss is expecting it. And I don't want to be picked on like that. You're putting me in a bad situation." That person's now playing the victim. After a while, the person who has taken on budgets and marketing and all these other things that were outside of their actual job, they were supposed to be leading people doing those things. They've been playing hero, 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 and now they're angry at everybody because they feel like they got dumped on, and they start attacking people. That creates turnover, it creates unhappiness, it pushes people in the wrong direction. So by looking at the way that things are happening within our organizations, you start to recognize, man, we do this a lot, the hero, victim, and villain mindset of creating drama in that drama triangle. We've got to get out of that situation where we're creating the problem and get into the situation where we're leading people in the right direction. That's where leadership language comes in. There's a really cool quote from Bruce Lee where he talked about how you need to be careful with the way that you word things and the way that you say things. He said, words are spelled, which means they have spell power over individuals. Now, I'm not saying that our words necessarily are some kind of witchcraft, but I am saying our words do have power. When somebody says something to you from a communication standpoint, you put in your mind what that must mean. So they send a message, you receive the message, but you make up based on your own stories what the message really means. The more we are consistent in our skills, our language, our standards, and our actions as leaders, the more people get the message we actually meant for them to get instead of some interpreted message based on their past experiences. Within the human mind, you have what's called the apperception mass. The apperception mass is the history of everything that you've gone through in your life and what it means to you, as well as how you're going to make sense of current things. When we perceive something, we go back to this apperception mass, this collection of meanings, and we go, what is this like? And then we take what it was like before and we overlay that on what we're going through now. That's what creates the meaning that we're experiencing, and that's what makes us move in a certain direction. When your team creates a leadership language, what you're discovering is this creates the power for you to move people in the right direction. I've seen some amazing things happen when people get on the same page with leadership. A few examples of that would be one of my friends in Jacksonville, Florida, that I got to do some work for, started in his emergency room at the hospital he was the CEO of, and he said, "Do your thing." And so he kind of turned me loose, which was really fun for me. And not that many people just turn me loose and let me do whatever I want to do to get people on the right track. But we did a 6-month study. We focused on building communication and motivation and coaching and the skills that are in our leadership academy. We taught those skills in short spurts over the next 6 months. And we did some team building stuff. And in that 6 months, we saw a $1.3 million increase in net profitability just in the emergency room. When you reduce turnover and increase performance, it's amazing what can happen. Jim Collins actually talked about this in his book, Good to Great, where he talked about the level 5 leader. Eckerd's versus Walgreens. Eckerd's isn't even around anymore, but at the time they were neck and neck. What Walgreens did is they went all in on developing their leaders and on listening to their people. By doing that, they created a common language, and in 18 months, they were outperforming Eckerd's, who they were neck and neck with, 20-1 on net profitability. Another 6 months later, Eckerd's gets sold to JCPenney's. who then sells it to CVS Pharmacy. CVS starts copying what Walgreens had done, and they move back up towards what was working. But all of that is based on the leadership. There's 4 roles that you as a leader are going to play in getting your teams going in the right direction. The first and most important thing that we're doing, especially post-pandemic, is we're rebuilding and building connection. It worked fine for people to work from home that had a history with one another, that had worked together in the past, and that kind of understood each other. But it is virtually impossible to build an effective team if you don't connect on a personal level. So part of what we do as leaders is we create an atmosphere where people can learn to like and trust one another. If you look at the 4 kind of stages of team development that Bruce Tuckman talked about in 1965, he said we form, that's where we're building connection. And then we storm, that's where we're learning to lead ourselves even through stress. Then we norm, we learn to lead forward in the right direction. Then we perform. That's where we achieve results. So along with the evolution of a team are the 4 roles that we're required to play that move us in that right direction. When we're leading ourselves, we're understanding that the discipline of self means everything. I can't make another person be accountable, but I can set up scenarios where they choose accountability as the natural choice for them. When we're leading forward, what we're really doing is we're helping people understand how to operate within their strengths. We have to understand who's good at what and how can we capitalize on those strengths. Einstein once said that everybody is a genius in their own right. But if you take a fish out of water and judge it based on its ability to climb a tree, it will always feel like a failure. When we find the things that people are brilliant at and we find ways to put them in that role and move them in that right direction, it makes a natural progression into achieving results. The achieving results, or the performance stage of every team, this is all about how we capitalize on it not being about self, but instead being about the success of the team and the success of the organization. People will buy into the success of the organization when they're doing something that is bigger than themselves. Viktor Frankl, when he talked about man's search for meaning, kind of summarized the book for you. He talked about you have to have first a purpose that goes beyond self. When we have a purpose that goes beyond self, we feel engaged and self-actualized, which led into Maslow's hierarchy of needs on motivation. Second thing that he talked about is we have to be surrounded with people that we like, know, and trust. 81% of turnover, voluntary self-termination, where I quit my job and leave, is based on the relationship with the boss or the boss's boss. 81%. 10% of voluntary self-termination is based on relationships with their coworkers. That means, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, 91% of why anybody leaves an organization has to do with people or relationships. So if we can fix the right language skills for leadership and the right skill sets, then we fix the people side, and that's what keeps people and engages people. We're driven towards a purpose, we stay for the people. The third thing that Frankl talked about is perspective. When you are going through struggles, if you have a solid team and you have a purpose that truly matters to you and matters to the world around you, it has to go beyond money. It's not that money's not important. I do believe very strongly in profitability, but it's not the first thing that you have to believe in. Profitability is an outcome from doing things right as a leader. This perspective is that when I struggle, it's worth it because the purpose and the people matter so deeply. That's what gets people moving in the right direction, because that's what taps in to the emotional portion of the brain and keeps us moving in that right direction. So when you think about building connection, there's 3 basic skill sets that you have to master in order to be great at building connection. The first is understanding and embracing diversity at different levels. Carl Jung talked about the conscious, the personal unconscious, and the collective unconscious minds. And what he talked about in there is that our unconscious biases are housed in the personal unconscious. So when we're looking at other people, whether it's from a generational perspective or race or ethnicity or sexual orientation or any other of the factors of diversity, what we start realizing is my values are what are determining whether or not I see people at their very best. When you start intentionally creating a value that says, I love people, I embrace people, I want everyone that works with me and for me to be successful, then you start looking for the good in the diversity. The simple reality is, from Harvard Business's research, diversity creates greater profitability, greater engagement, and greater satisfaction in the workplace. Value-based diversity is an understanding of where our values come from and why people see the world the way that they do. When you can understand why people are who they are, it becomes easier to embrace them for their greatness. The second factor in building great connection is effective communication. When we think about the way that we communicate, there's really only two sides to being a great communicator. The first side of being a great communicator is, can I set clear expectations? When we're setting expectations, there's three components that you have to master. When you set an expectation, it's what do you want? When specifically do you want it? Not ASAP, but say Friday at 10 a.m. might be a great specific time. And then how will you measure whether or not it was done right? What do you want? When do you want it? How will we know if we did a great job? When you can measure those three things and articulate those to other people, you've set a clear expectation. What happens a lot of times is, go do a great job is the definition we give people. A great job to one person means something different to somebody else. The second side of being a master communicator is listening effectively. We are in an absolutely overstimulated world. We have so much technology going on at all times. I led a webinar for a group of engineers not long ago, and I said, hey, quickly in the comments, type in if you're multitasking while this is going on. 80% of people in the webinar, there's about 60 people in it at that time, were multitasking. That's the world we live in. So the first thing you do to be a great listener is you focus just on what's going on and you avoid any distractions. You are never fully listening if you're doing multiple things, because the human mind, just like a computer, jumps quickly from one thing to the next, but you're not thinking divergently. You're going this way, you stop, go this way, stop, go this way. So you're going back and forth, but you're not fully focused unless you hone in just on the one thing. Second thing to be a great listener is you have to respond non-verbally. Your nonverbal communication is the primary way that people interpret the message that you're sending. Tone of voice, facial expression, body language, that's 93% of the communication message that other people get. Third thing that you have to do to be a great listener is you have to ask questions. That way the person knows that you're fully engaged and you're asking questions of them to clarify what they're talking about. This is when you're one-on-one in a staff meeting, when you're with your people. To be a great listener as a leader, you're asking for more information. And then the fourth thing is you feedback what you heard, but you put it in your own words. This summary tactic, so what you're saying would be a lead-in, or I want to make sure I understand you, and then you go through it, or that must have been, and you check for emotional context. Those are the feedback process. You don't do that at the end of every sentence, but it is critically important. Harvard also says that the vast majority of the problems that we're going to face in business, 85% to be exact, relate to the way that we communicate. Almost every other aspect of leadership ties in specifically to the manner in which we communicate. The third thing for building connection is to build the motivation of your people. When we learn to read our people and we learn to create the right environments, we're building a motivational strategy that taps into satisfying the lower order needs. So giving them a great place to work, good environment, the pay is what it should be. Then building the higher order needs, a sense of belonging, good internal and external esteem, and then self-actualization. I'm pushing myself to the best of who I'm capable of being. People don't actually want easy jobs. What people want is maximum challenge and maximum success. That's when we feel great about who we are and what we're doing. So motivation is based on creating scenarios where people can push themselves and move themselves up consistently within the right cultural environment. When we lead ourselves, there's three basic skill sets that you're mastering with that. The first is, can I manage what I allow into my day? When you think about the 80-20 rule, or what was called the Pareto principle originally, this is that 20% of what we're doing is creating 80% of the outcomes that we achieve. The problem that most people have is we try to manage time. Time is a finite or limited resource. You can't manage time. You can only manage what you allow into your time. So learning to manage priorities is all about understanding what are the things that move us in the right direction. Going back to the culture model, that middle piece workflow, that's helping people understand when you do this thing, that gets us the greatest result. If we do the 20% of things that matter the very most first, then what we find is that the 80% of the results that we were looking for, once that's covered, everything else is easy. We will have time to get to the other 20% of the outcomes that we needed because we've learned to avoid distractions and pursue the things that matter. A lot of that has to do with how you create self-accountability. And there's models for accountability that work, but the three questions I mentioned very early on, can you walk me through what happened? At what point could you have done it different? What will you do next time? This is the accountability theory. That first question is an understanding. The second question is an identification of the thing that didn't work right, where they say, I own that I made that choice. The third question puts them on the right path and helps them go in that right direction. The next skill within leading yourself is to manage the way that decision-making happens. Groupthink, or what Dr. Irving Janis talked about as poor decision-making within groups, is where one strong personality in the group seems to intimidate everybody else in the group. Most of us have had the experience where we're in a staff meeting or we're in a group meeting and somebody says something we think that's literally the worst idea I've ever heard. But we don't speak up in the group. Instead, once we leave the meeting, we go over to our buddy and like, hey, did you hear what he said that time? Oh my gosh, I didn't think he could come up with a worse idea, but he definitely topped it this time. Groupthink is building enough of the comfort where we've built our connection so that we trust each other enough and we have enough of a relationship that we will speak up in a respectful manner when something seems off. And there's enough mutual trust going back the other direction that it becomes a conversation. That takes a strong belief in self as a leader in order to be able to do that in a way that we don't feel like we're crumbling because somebody disagreed with us. So learning to manage group decision-making is about creating models for decision-making within your group. And anytime there's a group discussion or a decision that has to be made, you bring in a devil's advocate. Now, you don't want this to be the same person every time, or pretty soon people just start thinking they're the devil. The devil's advocate is somebody that you go to in front of everybody else and say, hey, Jody, would you be willing to disagree with everything that's said during this meeting? I want you to question it and challenge it and make us really work to justify it. When that person is given permission, they enjoy the process. It's actually kind of fun, and we make better choices. Groupthink is critically important. The third skill set is how do we set and track goals? We're at the stage right now, being in December of the year, where you should be doing your strategic planning for next year, and you should have measurable outcomes that you know you're going to go after. When you think of it from how do we get on target, how do we think from the end back to the beginning? That's the T. How do we assess our skills and our skill gaps? That's the A. How do we recruit the help, resources, or information that we need? That's the R. How do we give emotions, both positive towards achieving what we want and negative towards staying the same? So the G is give it emotions. How do we make sure that we keep our eyes wide open, measuring every detail as we go along, and being honest, not self-deceived about what's working, what's not working? Because a lot of times you'll find in the process of tracking our goals, this is the piece that gets skipped. People will go, we want to really increase our revenue. I want, more fans in the stands or more whatever, but then they're not honest that their lack of organization or their lack of follow through or their lack of a system might be causing the problem. Instead, they just go, man, it just didn't work. And I hear so often in corporate America when we do reviews in November of are we on track for the year, where people go, we just ran out of time. You never run out of time to hit your goals if you have an effective eyes wide open strategy. Every month, you should be having a conversation about your specific goals and targets, what's working, what's not working, and how to get back on track if it wasn't working. The final piece of this is to talk about your goals. Within your teams, you have to talk consistently about what your objectives are, what you're doing to get on the right track, and what's keeping you from that. That should be a monthly conversation that you have one-on-one with each one of your direct reports about their goals and objectives. You should have a conversation with your boss if you have a boss. If you're an entrepreneur, you should be having that conversation with your monthly business coach to make sure that you're on track. I've had a business coach for over 20 years, and I coach people. I find it so valuable to have that outside perspective because that's what keeps me on track. If I don't have somebody pushing me, it's very difficult to stay on track. The next piece on that leading forward, the third role that you play, there's 3 basic skill sets. And I talked about the coaching piece early on. When you're coaching for performance, you've identified the goals and objectives that you're going for, and you know how to observe behaviors, ask the right questions, and teach them to stay in front of their problems. When we coach, this isn't necessarily because something is messed up. Great coaches always stick with their players. When Michael Jordan was at the height of his career with the Bulls, he still had a coach. He didn't back down. And I still argue that he's the GOAT. He's the greatest of all times in basketball. But when you look at Jordan, not once did he go, coach, I don't need you. In fact, he credits his coach freshman year in high school with pushing him off the team to teach him how to have heart for the game. Coaches change everything. And you as a leader are a coach and a mentor, but you got to be paying attention. And the younger generations, really starting with the younger Xers, the millennials and Gen Z, we expect conversation. We expect that you're going to take time to spend time with us to give us advice on how to get better. There is virtually nobody in this world that wants to get worse at what they do. We are hardwired for mastery, for trying to grow and advance and see what the next level is. Conflict resolution requires a model as well. The problem that we have most of the time in conflict resolution is we make it personal. When we go to confront another person, let's say they have been late to staff meetings, and you do your staff meetings on Monday morning at 8:00, they've been late 3 weeks in a row. We go to them and say, I'm tired of you being disrespectful and being late. We've now judged the person, which creates defensiveness, which ensures that they're not going to be on time in the future. Instead, when we confront, we say the last 3 weeks in a row, you've been between 10 and 15 minutes late to the staff meeting. That really frustrates me because I have held the meeting until you got there, which cost other people time. My expectation moving forward is that you're going to be on time every time and be an active participant in the meeting. So it's fascinating to me when you look at all of the sides of conflict resolution, it's behavior, feeling, impact, reflective listening, which is communication, and then my expectations, which is also communication. So when we address the conflict, we're getting to the heart of their story. When you do the behavior, feeling, impact in the listening phase, the reflective listening, we're wanting to know what the steps are that they followed. Back to the 3 questions. We're wanting to know at what point they could have done it different and what they're going to do next time. The third skill set within leading forward is corrective counseling. Now, corrective counseling is when things have really gone sideways and you've got to dig into the behaviors. And there's a couple of models that work really, really well for changing a person's perspective. Step 1 in the model of corrective counseling or advanced behavior change is to understand the image that they desire from other people. So what we're asking for is, what is it that you want other people to see you as or know you as an individual within this organization? When they can identify what they want to be known as, then we can correlate that to the behaviors that they've been exhibiting. Most people are really unaware of how they're being perceived. So if they define first how they want to be perceived, and then the second step is we have them describe if they were looking at another person, what would make it unmistakable that they would perceive that other person, someone outside of self, in that specific manner. When they start looking at the way they would evaluate that, we can then correlate those behavior patterns with the ones they're actually exhibiting. That creates an awareness of who they are compared to who they said they wanted to be. I've used this strategy for about 18 years now, and it works wonders with someone who has been a chronic rule breaker or chronic low performer, because we create that awareness, then we pull them in the right direction so that we get them moving to the place that we need them to be in order for them to be successful. The fourth piece, when you're in the performance stage of the team, requires these three skill sets, problem solving being number one. So often when we go into problem solving in business, what I see in the model is, hey, this isn't working. What do you guys think we should do? And we just ask for ideas and then pick an idea. Using a scientific method, what you're really trying to do when you solve problems is you first have to state what it is that you need that you don't currently have. Almost 80% of your problem is solved once you understand the gap from where you are to where you want to be. So state the need as you see it. The next piece of this is you open up discussions and brainstorming. Within brainstorming, you create a framework that says for the next 10 minutes or 15 minutes tops, I wouldn't go above 15, but for this short amount of time, I want as many ideas as we can get on what we can do to achieve the gap between where we are and where we want to be. You stop talking about it as a problem and you start talking about it as moving like a goal from where we are to where we want to be. You then go back to all the brainstorming that you've done. You should have a list of 30, 40, 50 things in that 10 to 15 minutes, and you let go of anything that is not legal, moral, or ethical. So you get rid of those things. Then you vet the remaining ideas for which are the most likely to work and the least likely. So you one at a time. So we have to get rid of one idea. Which one we're getting rid of? You've already gotten rid of all the illegal, immoral, unethical stuff. Now you're eliminating one at a time till you get down to your top 3 or fewer ideas. That's what you end up taking action on. So you assign who's going to do what, by when, with what outcomes, back to setting expectation, and then you go do the work. You have to come back and evaluate what worked and what didn't work, or you won't know if you actually solved the problem. So you follow this specific model, SOLVE, if you listen to the start of each of those phrases. And when you follow that model, it's easy to solve any problem. But complex problems always have easy to understand wrong answers and specific stepped right answers. A complex problem usually has 4 or 5 problems within it. You solve the problems one at a time. You get the answer for each of the steps to get you where you want to go, and then you go do the work. When you're building your team, this is the part that I've seen skipped because of the pandemic. You're taking time to just engage at an emotional and relational level with your people. I do not recommend that you go out drinking with your direct reports. But what I am saying is, if you just take a little bit of time and do simple team building activities, if you're still working remotely, do them via Zoom. Have everybody wear their favorite t-shirt to a Zoom call and tell the story behind their favorite t-shirt. Give each person 4 or 5 minutes to tell their story, and you start to learn who they are at a self-concept level, and that's what creates the relationship. When Tugman talked about his 4 stages in 1965, forming, storming, norming, and performing, he came back in 72 and said, but when we adjourn, we start over. And adjourning is when you lose a member of the team, you add a new member to the team, or the team has completed its purpose. When you have high turnover, you never stay at that performance stage because you're always being knocked back down the ladder to the forming stage. Every new member of the team changes the dynamic of the team. And you've probably noticed that when you've had an amazing team, somebody leaves and you get the wrong person on the team, it destroys the team itself. The faster you get the wrong people out and the right people in, the better off you are. In building your team, it's based on communication, it's based on time, and it's based on trust. Trust isn't just that I trust you to do your job. Trust is I trust that it's okay to be vulnerable around you. The third piece of achieving results, and perhaps the thing that might be the most important moving forward in the next 24 months, is are we operating with the right ethics and the right values in order to create the kind of culture that people want to be a part of? If you look at different quick service restaurants, for example, The average Burger King in 2018, and I don't have their current numbers, but in 2018, the average Burger King did $1.2 million a year in revenue. The average McDonald's did $2.5 million per year in revenue. And at the same time, the average Chick-fil-A did $5.6 million per year in revenue, and they're closed one day a week. What that tells us is when you look at the order of investment in the culture and the values of the organization, Chick-fil-A is way up here, McDonald's is next, and Burger King is below that. The culture itself is what determines whether your people show up, give their best, and make you money. That culture does everything. If I were to ask you how you would complete this sentence if you worked at Chick-fil-A, if I said thank you, you would say, my pleasure. If you go to McDonald's and you say thank you when you get your order, they might say thank you, they might say next window, they might say something else. Same with Burger King. We have been trained as consumers to know exactly what to expect because they spend so much time building their culture. Whether you like them or not, they've done an amazing job on culture development for their specific teams, and that has resulted in significantly more profitability than what their competitors have been achieving. From what I talked to several owner operators of Chick-fil-A over the last year, their revenues went up significantly in both 2020 and in 2021, almost to the point where they feel slightly guilty that they've done so well, but their drive-throughs are packed all the time. The culture that we create creates the emotional experience of work. When we create the culture on purpose, we create the right emotional experience, which determines engagement, determines retention, and overall determines the performance of the person. When we're trying to find success in our organization, there really isn't a shortcut to getting to that great destination. What we're really focused on, what we should be focused on, is how do we consistently invest in our leaders so that they will invest in their people so that we will have the right product and service. So Richard Branson once said, it is perfectly okay for your customer to be first as long as your employees are more first. When you get to that state where the employees are more first than the customer, you find that people always want to work there. Marcus Buckingham, who is the kind of the originator of the concept of the strengths-based movement, he said, talent is the multiplier. The more energy and attention you invest in it, the greater the yield. Our people are our greatest asset, or without the right leadership, our greatest struggle. We want them to be the greatest asset that we have, which means that when we can consistently invest in the potential of our top leaders, working from the top down, we push people in the right direction. If you look back to John Maxwell's description in the 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership, he said that if you think you're a leader and you look back and see that no one is following, you're just out taking a walk. I love Maxwell's descriptions and his stories that go in that book. And if you've not read 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership, highly recommend the book, especially the updated version of it. But he talks about the fact that we're just trying to create influence so that we have an emotional pull for people to want to follow us. I wanted to go through this fairly quickly, but those are the skill sets and the 4 primary roles that we play as a leader. I'm going to open it up to questions, but if you don't mind writing down the bit link, the bit.ly/JH30MIN, it's a 30-minute conversation that I would love to have with you that I can find out where you're at as an organization and see if there's something that we can do to help you get there. We have an amazing 3-day event coming up in March. It's 3 days of how to go through those 12 skill sets and master the skills of being a great leader within your organization. This works in every industry. I've used this in everything from manufacturing to healthcare to tech to retail to food service. Every single industry, these 12 skills are the most important. And the way that